He grew up in Brooklyn, and one of his earliest memories was waving at Charles Lindbergh as the Lone Eagles parade passed triumphantly through his neighborhood. He took his first flight when he was 7, and barely out of his teens was World War II's youngest American fighter pilot in China. After the war, he earned a degree in aeronautical engineering, and when his military career ended, he helped design the rocket engines that took man to the moon. That accomplished, he joined the staff of the National Air and Space Museum before it was built and helped turn it into the most visited museum in the world. He is Donald Lopez, and he is a legend of air power. He was born in 1923 in Brooklyn. He grew up surrounded by aviation, though no one in his family was an aviator. It was the times as much as anything. Flight was still new, records seemed to fall every day, and barnstormers were pop culture heroes. When Lopez was 3 and a half, his parents took him to see the greatest of them all, Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh's parade passed through Brooklyn. One of Lopez's earliest memories is seeing Lindbergh sitting on the back of a convertible, waving at the thousands of people who had gathered just to catch a glimpse of him. Lopez's parents befriended a barnstorming pilot, and when Lopez was 7, the pilot took him up for a ride. He was, he says, hooked on flight from that day on.
I used to ride my bike out to Floyd Bennett Field and hang around, and my pilot friend was hopping passengers in cabin walkos, and I'd stand by the fence and look as sad as possible, and every now and then, when he didn't have all the passengers he needed, he'd let me go up with him.
Floyd Bennett Field was, in many ways, the capital of aviation in the United States. Lopez watched from outside the fence as the royalty of early aviation passed through, on the way to what he imagined to be a great adventure.
He got to see the likes of Wiley Post and his aircraft, the Winnie Mae, Louise Thaden and her Staggerwing Beach, even Balbo's Savoia Marchetti flying boats when they came through. And there was some Navy Helldivers stationed there, and they would often let the kids sit in the cockpit. So he really had an interesting and unique exposure to aviation at a young age.
Everybody was interested in it then. All the kids were. Flying was a relatively new thing in the country, I guess, and it was just something that looked real exciting and great.
At the age of 15, Lopez's family moved to Florida, and his contact with aviation temporarily ended. His fascination with it, however, did not. He spent long afternoons reading pulp magazines about pilots and flying, and knew everything there was to know about the great pilots of World War I. His family lived outside Tampa. He could see and hear planes from nearby MacDill Army Air Base as they flew over, but lived so far from the base that he could not stand outside the fence as he had in New York. In the years between the World Wars, American air power withered. Congress approved almost no money for upgrading aircraft, and every year it seemed as if the force grew smaller and smaller. After high school, Lopez tried to enlist as an aviation cadet, but the Army Air Force didn't need him. They told him to come back when he was older and had a college degree. He went to college and enrolled in the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a government-sponsored basic flight school. While he was in training, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Army Air Corps quickly dropped the college degree requirement for pilot cadets.
So I went down to join up, and they told me if I joined up, I'd have to be probably marching for the next 9 months because they didn't have room in the flying schools for all the people that were applying. So he said, don't bother, wait a few months.
Lopez returned to college. All around him, his country was gearing up for war. Men were enlisting and shipping out. Battles in the Philippines and Guadalcanal were on the radio.
The country had never been attacked before, and it was considered a real sneaky, dirty trick, and everybody was really outraged and In fact, people who never heard of Pearl Harbor were just as outraged. And it was very much like the feeling everybody had right after the September 11th. They bombed the towers and things. Everybody, patriotism sprung up all over the place where it hadn't been very noticeable before. But everybody realized what we had to do and wanted to do it, and almost universally in this country, I mean.
And Lopez, who wanted more than anything to fly, was lugging textbooks from class to class.
But in May, I just couldn't stand it anymore, so I went down and got sworn in as an aviation cadet. Even then, I didn't get called till September of 1942.
Lopez became part of an Air Corps trying desperately to catch up with the Germans and Japanese. The instructors had little or no combat experience, and the only equipment available for training was almost comically primitive.
You had to fly a sort of a fake airplane that they moved the lights around. You had to move the controls to make the lights go next to the one that was lit up, so all that stuff. And then they decided whether you'd be a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier.
The Air Corps tabbed Lopez as a pilot and put him in the pilot training pipeline. He went from base to base, always learning more about military custom, flight, weapons, and tactics. He flew PT-19s and BT-13s, the legendary Vultee vibrator. He learned night flight and cross-country navigation. He mastered every aircraft easily, though as they got larger and more powerful, they posed new challenges. Lopez met those challenges and was selected out of his class to train his last 10 hours in P-40s, then a frontline fighter.
Sort of overwhelming at first because it was so much bigger than anything I'd flown. You can't see out the front at all. On first takeoff, I nearly ran off both sides of the runway because the torque was so strong, and I nearly went off the left side, and I overcorrected and nearly went off the right side, and I got in the air before I went off the left side again. And, but after that, I didn't have any trouble. I landed.
Flight training complete, he was assigned to a P-40 squadron to await overseas deployment. He flew nearly every day, staging mock dogfights with P-47s and P-39s from nearby bases. The P-40 was a heavy, not very maneuverable plane, but required special tactics in dogfighting.
You couldn't turn with the Japanese planes. They turned too fast. They're much lighter than our planes. So you never tried to turn, and we used the tactics developed by General Chennault, and it worked very well. But we just did high-speed passes, fired at them, pulled out, and came back again and tried to fire at them again.
As Lopez honed his skills, the Flying Tigers became as much heroes to him as the great pilots he'd seen at Floyd Bennett Field. After 2 months of hassling over Florida's interior, he got orders to report to Miami. He had no idea where he was going. What mattered to Lopez was that he was finally on his way to the war. When Don Lopez shipped out from Miami, he didn't know for sure where he was going. A trained P-40 pilot, he knew there were few places where Warhawks were still in use. A student of the flight tactics of the Flying Tigers, he knew that there were more P-40s in China than anywhere else. Americans had been fighting in China for years. Claire Chennault had set up the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, in 1940, long before Pearl Harbor. They had become legends, but once the United States officially entered the war, the Army took over the AVG's operation. Lopez arrived in India as one of a flood of rookie pilots sent to augment the AVG's tiny force. He spent a few weeks practicing his strafing and bombing under veterans of the air war in China. Ordered to the 14th Air Force, he and another pilot hitched a ride over the hump in a B-24. The 14th Air Force assigned him to the 23rd Fighter Group.
The 23rd Group was not like a lot of the groups in Europe where the whole group was together on a base. We had three squadrons at that time, and each one was at a different base about maybe a couple hundred miles apart.
The job of keeping those widespread squadrons together as a functional fighting unit fell to legendary fighter pilot Tex Hill. Hill had been one of the original Flying Tigers, and even though the Army Air Corps had taken over operations in China, he remained to continue fighting. Hill, though an officer in the Army, was casually scornful of regular Army trappings.
I was kind of in awe because I'd read all about him. And I went to his office, and his office was just a very small, bare, wooden office with one desk and two chairs. and a map, and an in and an out basket. And the in basket had peanuts in it, and the out basket had the empty shells, and that was it, no paperwork.
One thing that became evident was Don Lopez was born to be a fighter pilot. So to get into that theater of combat, and there was plenty of action and plenty of challenges as well, was probably as exciting as could be for someone of that age, especially under the tutelage of someone like Tex Hill, and having been in the same unit as Robert Scott, who was famous for writing God Is My Co-Pilot. These were all names that were almost of mythical status to someone of his age training to be a fighter pilot at that time.
At 19, Lopez was one of the youngest American pilots in one of the youngest aviation units in the world.
We had about 3 or 4 pilots in the squadron that were 26 and 27, and we thought they were really, really ancient. Used to tell the room boys to check every morning whether to wake them up or cover them up.
His first combat mission was strafing Japanese patrol boats on the Yangtze River. The Japanese, whose supply lines were long and inefficient, were in the process of stealing a whole rice crop from the Chinese peasants who'd grown it. They would take an area and hold it only long enough to empty the fields and storage bins, pull back, and then take the next valley over. The American pilots were assigned to support the Chinese army, who were trying to disrupt the Japanese and prevent the theft of their rice.
Every mission we went, we hoped we'd run into some Japanese planes so we could, but we didn't. My first 7 missions, we didn't see any Japanese.
Though the duty wasn't glamorous, it was critical. The Chinese army depended on American air cover. The relatively few American pilots in China were, in effect, keeping the Chinese army a viable fighting force. As a result, the Japanese had to keep hundreds of thousands of troops in China that would otherwise have been available to fight American and British forces elsewhere in the Pacific. The only times that Lopez got to fight against Japanese aircraft were when the Japanese mounted massive bombing attacks against the Chinese positions and American bases. The resulting air battles were as much melee as dogfight, with dozens of planes swirling around the sky in a confusing tangle. It was in one of those battles that Lopez got his most unusual kill.
In the distance, I saw a P-40 being chased by an Oscar, way out of range, but I took a great big lead and fired over that way, hoping my tracers, he'd see the tracers and break away from him, which he did. But he started heading toward me, which wasn't part of my plan. And we were making a head-on pass at each other. And I was diving a little bit, he was climbing a little bit. And when we got within range, we both started firing. I could see his guns winking, you could see the fire on them, and I could see my bullets flashing on the front of his airplane. And then I wasn't trying to ram him or anything, but I didn't want to brake first because they didn't want him to be on my tail. So at the very last second before we hit engine to engine, he started a very sharp right bank, which they could do, but it was a little late, and my wing hit his wing, and I knocked most of his wing off and knocked about 2 to 3 feet off of my wing. But it didn't seem to bother the P-40 a lot. It flew fine after that.
The Japanese plane went down, and Lopez went back into the battle.
He proved himself to be a very competent pilot very early on, and I would think that his commanders probably saw that in him and depended on him as he became part of the unit.
He flew more than 100 missions in China and stayed on after his flight assignment to help in mission planning. He left China in early 1945, credited with 4 kills. He was in New York visiting his family on VE Day.
Boy, it was really something. Everybody was cheering and running around the streets, and it was nice to be in uniform in those days. And they had a real good deal. If you were an officer, I guess they went to there was some hotel you went to, and they gave you tickets to any Broadway show you wanted to go to, and all sorts of real nice things. And so I saw 3 Broadway shows just in the 4 days I was there.
The Army assigned Lopez to Eglin Army Air Base in Florida as a test pilot. Only a few weeks after the end of the war, he was training in the first American jets, the P-59, and after that, the P-80.
What they would do is take combat pilots and move them into testing at Eglin, where they would get the latest, greatest aircraft and test their systems under combat circumstances, or as close to it as they could get.
Eglin was, Lopez says, fighter heaven. Though the flight test activity was shifting gradually west to Muroc, now Edwards Air Force Base, Eglin remained an active flight test center. It was a period of furious innovation, the transition from props to jets, an obsession with the Air Force. During the week, Lopez flew jets, and on weekends, there were outdated but still feisty P-51s and P-47s available for hassling over the Gulf of Mexico.
And we'd fly in air shows a lot. The P-80s were in great demand at air shows, and we were responsible for flying in the air shows in the Southeast, because we had the only jets in the Southeast at the time. So they'd send us by ones and twos to air shows to fly, and we didn't do much because we just went real fast, and everybody was amazed.
As a test pilot, Lopez flew both Air Force and Navy aircraft. He flew a P-80 to Alaska for cold weather testing and went briefly to Korea to do operational testing on the new F-86 Starfighter, and to England for a rotation with the RAF. For all the transience of his Air Force life, his most impressive accomplishment might be this. He somehow found time to complete his college education. After 3 years of night school, he received a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering. The Air Force was so impressed by his achievement that it sent him to Caltech, where he earned a master's degree, also in aeronautical engineering. He taught at the brand new Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs and was a founding member of the thermodynamics department. He finished his Air Force career in the Pentagon, an expert on missiles, helping to plan the rocket-based warfare that has become commonplace. He retired in 1964, but his career was far from over. Retired from the Air Force after 22 years, Don Lopez went to work for Bellcom, a division of Bell Labs. Bellcom's specialty was rocket development, and their main customer was NASA. For the next 8 years, Lopez worked inside NASA's offices. The irony of that placement did not escape him. While still a test pilot, he had been one of only 110 pilots certified by NASA as eligible to apply for the newly created astronaut program.
They were going to have 12 astronauts originally, but they had to give them a really extensive physical test. So they took the first half of them and tested them. Thought they'd have to test 110 to get 12. They decided to go with 7 instead of 12. And they had no trouble. Everybody volunteered. And so I never got tested, so I didn't. So the next time they were recruiting for them, I applied again, but I was about 3 months too old, and they didn't accept me. So, yeah, I would love to have done it, but I had a pretty good life without that anyway, so I wasn't too terribly disappointed.
As a civilian at NASA, he worked on the rocket engines that would power the second stage of the Saturn V rocket that would eventually carry men to the moon. The kid whose earliest memory was seeing Charles Lindbergh in a parade, who had watched early aviation heroes from outside the fence of Floyd Bennett Field in New York, who had studied the tactics of the legendary Flying Tigers, and who had then found himself serving under the command of the very pilots he had idolized, was now involved in the most ambitious aerospace project in history. In July 1969, Apollo 11 took off. The second stage engines that Lopez had worked on worked perfectly, pushing the command and lunar modules out of Earth orbit and toward the moon. When Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the moon's surface, he became the greatest aviation hero since Lindbergh. Before the moon landings were even over, Lopez moved on to the Skylab project. Skylab was the first American space station, improvised out of the modified Saturn V second stage that had powered the trip to the moon. And then, with the space program winding down, Bellcom, the NASA contractor Lopez worked for, decided to get out of the space business entirely.
That wasn't really their business. Bell Labs has, working on other. So they offered everybody jobs in their system, but I really wasn't too interested in working on telephones and things like that. So I was looking around for some other jobs. There weren't much engineering jobs right at that time.
His wife read in the newspaper that the National Air and Space Museum had been funded to expand into a new building. She urged Lopez to apply for a job. Though he didn't have any museum experience, Lopez sat down and wrote a letter to his old friend, astronaut Michael Collins, who had been named director of the museum. Collins hired him immediately. Lopez joined the staff in 1972. His first day of work was the day the museum broke ground for its new building.
I was involved in all the planning for all of the airplane exhibits, and I was actually the curator on about 4 of the galleries myself.
Lopez's job was, in effect, to build a shrine to the heroes of aviation who had inspired him his whole life. He went to work in Washington, traveling to collect the artifacts that he felt the museum needed if it was going to tell the real story of aviation. And as far as Lopez was concerned, there was no more important story to tell.
I think it's been fascinated people through the ages. You know, every god in every religion, every myth you ever hear about, the gods or the mythical characters are flying. And the people have always wanted to fly. It just gives you a whole new dimension. And it happened in a lifetime. It's something people can relate to.
People did indeed relate to the story of aviation that the Air and Space Museum told. Lopez's passion for and deep personal understanding of aviation came through in the exhibits. The number of visitors far exceeded expectations, and the Air and Space Museum became the most popular museum in the world.
When we got the money for it, the Smithsonian, as opposed to the Air and Space Museum people, thought, who wants to see a hangar on the mall? They said, you'll probably get maybe 3 million visitors the first year because it's the bicentennial year, but then you'll probably level off about 2.5 million, which is what some of the other museums were getting about that time. We got 1 million the first 25 days. We got over 10 million the first year, and we've averaged since then right about a little over 9 million people a year.
Lopez made the National Air and Space Museum the last stop in his long and remarkable career. The kid who'd learned to fly in a biplane hung a biplane on the ceiling of the most popular museum in the world and retired once and for all.
As I say, all that 75th guys, they're just really top-notch. He is one of the real outstanding fighter pilots, and then the job he's done here at the Smithsonian is really outstanding.
Neat thing about Don Lopez is he's just a great guy. He's probably the nicest person you'd ever want to meet, and I don't think you'd come across anyone that's ever met him that would say otherwise. He was someone who learned at an early age what he wanted to do and went out to pursue that to the best of his ability, and really reached the pinnacle of several careers in aviation. And yet he would probably be the last one to say that.